You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, a renewables record as more wind, hydro and solar power is installed around the world than ever before. But there's a warning, it's still nowhere near enough. Why meat and dairy production could be undermining key climate and deforestation goals made at the COP26 summit. And the irreplaceable trees damaged in Storm Arwen, as the National Trust says gardens and landscapes could take decades to restore. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, a record number of solar panels, wind turbines and other forms of renewable power have been installed around the world this year, according to the International Energy Agency. It found that capacity from renewable energy is now predicted to exceed that of both fossil fuels and nuclear by just 2026. So far, in 2021, 290 gigawatts of renewables have been commissioned around the world. Now, to put that into context, 1 gigawatt of power would power 10 million light bulbs. The amount of capacity installed this year is 3% more than 2020, which was itself a record year for renewable growth. Now, according to the IEA, 95% of the increase in global energy generation over the next 5 years will come from renewables rather than fossil fuels or nuclear power. More than half of that will come from solar power. Nearly 30% will come from wind power, and the remainder will be from other renewable sources, mainly hydroelectric, which uses the power of water in motion to generate electricity. Well, renewables capacity is growing all over the world, but it's exploding in China, where they're expected to reach 1,200 gigawatts by 2026. Now, that's 4 years ahead of their 2030 budget. And India is set to double its capacity, setting it well on the way to a target of 50% of electricity to come from renewable sources by the end of the decade. Well, here in the UK, the aim is for 100% of the country's electricity to come from renewables by 2035. And if we look at our real-time power mix in Great Britain right now, we can see that 38% of electricity is coming from gas, around 2% from coal, 36% from renewables, 6% from biomass, and 10% is coming from nuclear. But the International Energy Agency says the growth rate of renewable capacity must double if the world is to meet its target of net zero emissions by 2050, as our business correspondent Helen Ann Smith explains.
So this is a really detailed report from the International Energy Agency, essentially having a really good look at the renewables market. How's it performing? What value's been added? Is it enough? And on the surface of it, it's pretty good news. The report says we're really set to massively accelerate the amount of renewable energy that we have globally up to the year 2026. In fact, 95% of new energy, new power sources in that time will be renewables. And as you said in your introduction there, by that date, the renewable sector energy added will be the equivalent of the entire fossil fuel energy capacity that we currently have at the moment. So that's really good news. It pointed as well to the speed in which these things are being added. It will really speed up in the next 5 to 6 years compared to what it has been doing. So that's good news. Why is it doing so well? Well, the report pointed to positive support from governments, commitments made at COP and other things as well. But crucially as well, it's as much about private sector investment and private sector incentives. And there really are incentives for the private sector to invest in renewable energies. It can really see that there is money to be made in this sector in the years to come. Is it enough? Well, sadly, as with so many things when it comes to climate change, the report says no, at the moment it's not. In order to reach the targets that we should be reaching, wind and solar capacity would need to double again in the next 6 years, and things like bioenergy as well would need to quadruple again in order to reach those targets. So it's not enough. But the report really points to the fact that if there could be a little bit more support for the private sector, then many, many more hundreds of billions of dollars of investment could be unlocked. Things like more support in kind of integrating into the national grid, things like that would really help. So lots still to do, but good news for a burgeoning sector that will clearly help in the fight against climate change.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other climate news. And Northern Ireland experienced its warmest autumn on record this year. Over September, October and November, the temperature in the country averaged 10.9 degrees Celsius. The unusually warm autumn followed the nation's third warmest summer on record, during which a national record of 31.3 degrees Celsius was set. More than a quarter of UK bird species are now considered seriously threatened. Greenfinches, swifts and the Bewick swan has been added to the red list on the Birds of Conservation Concern report. Overall, 70 species are in severe decline or at risk of extinction, according to the new assessment from a coalition of government wildlife bodies and bird charities. The Business and Energy Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, has told MPs that weather events like Storm Arwen could become more frequent in the UK due to climate change. It comes as thousands of homes are still without electricity 5 days after the storm hit northern England and Scotland. And that warning comes as the National Trust says Storm Arwen has caused severe damage to some of the UK's most precious trees. As the world-famous Bodnant Garden in North Wales, more than 50 trees were uprooted, including a 51-metre coast redwood. The full extent of the damage is still being assessed, but the restoration is likely to cost more than £3 million. And last year, Captain Sir Tom Moore raised nearly £40 million for the NHS by walking 100 laps of his garden. Now an area of ancient woodland near his childhood home in West Yorkshire will be renamed Captain Tom's Memorial Wood in honour of his efforts. 3,000 new hedgerow trees will also be planted on the 17 acres of land at Home House Wood. Now, we farm animals for food risks undermining key climate and deforestation goals set out at the COP26 summit. A network of food industry investors has warned only 18% of global meat, fish and dairy producers are on track to achieve even a partial reduction in their methane emissions. So let's look back to COP26, which began just a month ago, where more than 100 countries signed the Global Methane Pledge, agreeing to cut emissions of the greenhouse gas by 30%. Now, the UN Food Agency says livestock accounts for 44% of man-made methane emissions. Yet, according to a report by the FAIR Initiative, less than a fifth of the world's biggest livestock producers currently measure even some of their emissions. Now, the report also found that 93% of meat and dairy farmers who source soy for animal feed from areas at high risk of deforestation do not have a policy to mitigate the practice. Well, joining me now is Arti Ramachandran, who's Director of Research and Engagements at the FAIR Initiative. So welcome to you. So tell us, what more can be done then? What can animal agriculture do to reduce their methane emissions short of stop farming cattle?
Well, I mean, that is part of it. But I mean, let's go back to some of the stats that you pointed out, Anna, which is that most of these companies are yet to start tracking emissions, methane emissions. As you've pointed out, less than a fifth of these companies are actually tracking methane emissions. And even these are partial methane emissions. And let's be very clear, without us reducing methane emissions on an annual basis, we are not going to meet the keep temperature rise to under 1.5 C. That's simply not going to sort of happen, looking at some of the pathways that the IPCC has put forth. So we absolutely need for companies to be taking this very seriously.
Well, yes, and is it up to companies? Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to mention the fact that, as we said in our introduction, it was over 100 world leaders who signed this methane emissions pledge at COP26. But is it down to governments then, who've signed up to this, to take the lead on this rather than companies?
Well, I'd say it's both, isn't it? I mean, we all have to be doing our jobs as part of the body politic. I mean, certainly regulators and policymakers need to be making the right or sending the right signals, the right incentives for these companies to make the changes necessary, as do the company leadership. I mean, they have to recognize that this is a risk to their business. This growing climate transition risk is going to increase costs of doing business for these companies. It's going to also sort of have a range of physical risk and repercussions for them as temperatures increase. It's going to start, sort of increasing feed volatility. It's going to start reducing the productivity of their animals. So it's something that they really absolutely have to take much more seriously. And so we all, and as consumers, of course, we have to make the right choices. So I think it's a confluence of measures that many actors have to take.
Well, that's interesting. You talk about making the right choices. What role do you think that individuals can play, and how important is transparency when individuals decide to make their choices?
Well, I mean, fact is that consumers, if there is a responsibility here for consumers, it is to ask more questions, as many consumers already are, right? And so we're seeing that consumers want to know what's on their plate. They want to know how some of their food was made and what the sort of climate impacts or environmental impacts was involved in making that food. And I mean, sorry, but to come back to the question of individuals, I mean, we have investors too asking very similar questions. They're asking questions on exactly what are we financing? Because if we're financing companies that have large-scale deforestation and forest loss in their supply chains, that means we're financing companies that are vulnerable to damaged brands. They're financing companies that are exacerbating climate risks, which then could sort of in turn come back and reduce the productivity of these companies themselves. So that's something that investors are beginning to take much more seriously now.
Aarti Ramachandran, very interesting to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Do stay with us. Coming up after the break, I'm going to be joined by Michal Nachmany from Climate Policy Radar and Senior Lecturer in Climate Law at Edinburgh University, Navraj Ghali. And we're going to be discussing if the world is moving to renewable energy fast enough and whether we all need to go vegan to save the planet.
Dowd, and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against, is back-breaking work. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID. Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Did you know if we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution? What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
The morning will be mainly fine, but there'll be wintry showers in the southwest for a time and near northern and eastern coasts. It'll be cold for most, mild in the far west. Showers in the east will become increasingly confined to Norfolk through the afternoon. Most places will then be fine into the evening, but Ireland, Northern Ireland and Western Scotland will see some rain and hail snow later. Clean North Atlantic air means air pollution levels will remain low, measuring just 2 or 3 on the Air Quality Index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Dr. Michal Nachmany, founder and CEO of Climate Policy Radar, and Navraj Ghali, a senior lecturer in climate law at the University of Edinburgh. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, first of all, 2 reports out today show there's been a huge expansion in renewable energy capacity across the world. But there's also a warning that it's not enough to reach global net zero targets by the middle of the century. And Navraj, first of all, I just want to point out what the IEA have said about this. They say that this year's record renewable electricity additions are another sign that a new global energy economy is emerging. Would you agree? It's really good news, isn't it?
Yeah, it is good news. I mean, it's the extension of a trend which we've been seeing for quite a long time. And especially after in the last couple of years, it's been very difficult to get financing for new fossil fuel projects, which is a climatically very positive step. So, this is part of a trajectory which we've been mapping. The question is the rate of change sufficiently fast? And I think most views would be that no, it isn't, but there are reasons to be optimistic that the rate of change will increase to the appropriate levels.
Well, yes, and we'll come back to that. But Michal, what do you make of this? Do you think it shows that the world is taking climate change seriously?
I think those answers are never binary, and we always have to ask how can we do more and faster, and how can we accelerate the rate of the transition while making it equitable and sustainable, worth it for investors, worth it for private companies, worth it for individuals, so we can all benefit from those changes. Now, the point here is that this is a virtuous circle potentially between policymaking and between the private sector. Policymaking has sent positive signals, as the IEA notes in its report, that have facilitated this transition. Continuing those signals is what enables faster deployment of renewables. But also we need to remember the competing and the completing side of this, which is fossil fuels. The more we legislate and regulate fossil fuel consumption, exploration, and so on, the more that we can advance renewables. And that is a really important thing to do those things in tandem. Now, the policy measures that will advance renewable energy and drive down the costs of those will enable us to do more, to have even more ambitious policy measures in place, bringing forward, for example, India's NDC target, which is currently a net zero by 2070, and currently facilitated by the current prices of renewables, bring those down with faster deployment globally, and we'll be able to bring that even faster.
Well, yes, and Navraj, do you agree with that? Because as you were hinting, the IEA is saying at the moment the rate of increase is not fast enough to hit those net zero targets. So how much is this down to governments, do you think, and how much will it be down to market forces?
Well, market forces are working very conveniently for a lot of renewables. So in large parts of the world, practically everywhere, renewables are cost competitive or undercutting the price of new fossil fuels, which is why we're seeing the balance of new capacity that you described earlier. For the purposes of governments, though, what we're seeing is that whilst a lot of progress is being made in a lot of places, there is still really strong financial pipeline for new fossil fuel investments through export credit agencies, through the Belt and Road Initiative in China. So, you know, there are a number of different stories here. There's the, you know, open market, liberal world, and then, you know, there's the larger part of the world, frankly, in which this isn't the case. So, you know, if you look along the Belt and Road, you'll see huge the pipeline of coal-fired power plants. The transmission of fossil fuels is still in a relatively healthy place, and that is just not at all consistent with a 1.5 degree or even a 2 degree world.
Michael, very briefly, there was an agreement at COP as well amongst some countries to stop investing in overseas fossil fuel plants. I mean, that's progress as well, isn't it?
But we need to remember that not investing in coal, for example, is important, but building infrastructure that is very carbon intensive, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, is something that will lock us into many years of carbon intensive usage of that infrastructure. And those things are really important to remember. So like Navraj said, we really need to make those policy steps now, both on the fossil fuels and on the renewables, and those work in tandem. The sooner that fossil fuels will be not competitive, and some of them already aren't, with renewable energy, the easier it will be to phase those out.
OK, let's move on to our next topic now, shall we? And a new report today has claimed that cows are the new coal. So as we heard earlier, the FAIR Global Investor Coalition are calling for far more to be done to address emissions from the agricultural sector. So is it time we all went vegan to help address climate change? And Navraj, let me just quote from this commission FAIR. They say that the emissions from agriculture are on a level with the greenhouse gases emitted by the EU, US and Japan combined. So what's your take on this? Is it possible to farm animals without harming the planet?
I'm surrounded, actually, where I live, I'm surrounded by fields which are full of sheep and cows. So I spend a lot of my time dodging them. But there are all sorts of innovations which animal scientists are engaging with on feedstocks for cattle, but the fundamental issue, I think, is really around what is happening in mass-scale farming, in particular in places like Brazil, where we're not only where the emissions associated with beef in particular are not just the ways in which cows emit gases from both ends, but especially from the deforestation which is associated with that style of raising cattle. And that is a very, very tough nut to crack. I mean, it's, you know, we're again talking about one of those hard to regulate jurisdictions of, you know, Bolsonaro's Brazil. So, you know, engaging in that sort of context is much, much harder, I think, and equally critical. You know, food and land use are really, you know, the two of the hardest to abate sectors. Electricity, which is where we started this conversation, is where we've made massive strides, as you've just indicated. But food and land use are really much, much harder, and we've scarcely started working in that space.
Well, that's right, isn't it, Michael? And the decision about whether to go vegan is a very personal one. People want choice, don't they? And telling people what they should eat is going to be very, very tough. No, people want to be able to be individuals, and with something as basic as diet, they want to choose their own food.
You're absolutely right. And I think if we think about, you know, you put out the word vegan out there, and this is very emotional. And you put out anything that relates to food, and we're already in a culture war. And that is important to acknowledge. And it's important for us to do that and bring everyone along with us. And bring everyone along with us is enable a transition to lower carbon lives and livelihoods that will enable us to transition to net zero while not intervening in everybody's diet. But
very quickly,
here's the story, right? If renewables replace fossil fuels, we already have alternatives to meet. We have
Okay.
lower carbon
I'm
alternatives,
so sorry.
plant-based and lab-grown, and we really need to think about those in the same terms that we think about renewables.
OK, lovely. Sorry to cut you off. We're out of time, but you made your point very well there. Mikhail Nachmany and Navraj Gali, thanks both very much indeed. So that's it for me for tonight. Do stay tuned for Sky News tonight. We've got a panel of experts who's going to be answering your questions about the new Omicron variant of COVID-19.